Hey guys, tonight we begin with the scandalous life and deeply confusing decisions of Fredegund of Neustria, a woman who could have starred in a medieval soap opera. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before she was a queen, Fredegund was what polite chroniclers call a maidservant, and what impolite chroniclers probably called a walking HR violation. She worked in the service of Queen Brunhilda, wife of King Chilperic I, a man whose idea of marital fidelity was, what if I didn't? Somehow, between folding linens and managing court gossip, Fredegund managed to seduce the king. Was it charm? Was it strategy? Was it simply that Chilperic had the self-control of a wet sponge? We may never know. But what we do know is that shortly after Fredegund appeared, Brunhilda disappeared. Literally. She was forced into a convent, which, in the 6th century, was one robe short of a prison sentence. Fredegund took her place in the royal bed, and soon enough, the royal throne. It was a meteoric rise from broom closet to palace suite, and in classic Fredegund fashion, it involved as little mercy as possible. This wasn't a romantic tale of a servant girl finding true love. This was Game of Thrones meets House of Gucci, but with more fleas. Fredegund wasn't just ambitious, she was surgical. Every obstacle between her and power was eliminated. Quietly, efficiently, and sometimes with poison. Even other wives didn't stand a chance. When Chilperic later married a Visigothic princess named Galswintha, yes, that was her real name, no vowels were harmed, she was soon found dead, strangled in her own bed, allegedly by someone who definitely wasn't Fredegund, but might have worn her perfume. By this point, Fredegund had become more than just a royal consort. She was the architect of her own rise, a woman playing chess while everyone else was still poking at the board with spoons. You'd think after marrying into the Merovingian dynasty and eliminating her royal competition, Fredegund might take a break, maybe enjoy some embroidery or mild tax reform. But no, Fredegund saw peace the way a cat sees a glass on the edge of a table. A challenge. Enter Galswintha, the poor Visigoth princess who thought she was marrying into royalty, only to realize too late she'd actually joined an underground murder club with matching crowns. Galswintha was queen number... well, it doesn't really matter. What matters is she made the rookie mistake of asking for dignity and loyalty in her marriage. Chilperic was confused by both terms. When Galswintha expressed her displeasure at Fredegund, still lurking around like an ex who didn't understand boundaries, she was found dead, strangled, in bed. The kind of tragic accident that tends to happen when your rival used to be a servant and still remembers how to slip poison into your linen spray. Chroniclers at the time didn't directly point fingers because they enjoyed living, but they did raise some medieval eyebrows. Which is impressive, considering most of them had lice and quills for pens. Chilperic, always a man of depth, shallow puddle depth, but still, shrugged and married Fredegund. Nothing says soulmate like cleaning up a suspicious murder scene together. To the outside world, this looked like a messy royal scandal. To Fredegund, it was Thursday. And let's not forget the bigger picture here. Fredegund wasn't just removing obstacles. She was consolidating power. Every woman who died, every rival who vanished, was one less person threatening her son's inheritance, or her own grip on court politics. She played long games, and by long, we mean blood-soaked. The court of Neustria had more intrigue than a soap opera written by Machiavelli on a bender. And Chilperic? He didn't mind. Maybe because he genuinely didn't notice. Or maybe because he assumed women just died when they complained too much. Hard to say. 6th century kings were not exactly known for their pattern recognition. Brunhilda was not the sort to let things go, especially not strangled sisters, poisoned marriages, or Fredegund's smug little face. She married Chilperic's brother, King Sigebert of Austrasia, and proceeded to launch one of the pettiest, bloodiest rivalries in early medieval history. Think Real Housewives of the Merovingian court, but with more assassinations and fewer hair extensions. Fredegund, naturally, responded like any rational person would. She sent hired thugs to murder Sigebert. Not just once, multiple times. Eventually, one of them succeeded. Sigebert was stabbed to death during a negotiation, which in 6th century Gaul translated to political compromise. With Sigebert dead, Fredegund seized power in Neustria, but Brunhild was far from defeated. She ruled on behalf of her son and began a decades-long vendetta against Fredegund that would turn northern France into a giant, muddy chessboard. The two women waged war like it was a full-time job. Assassins, betrayals, bribed nobles, secret lovers, rogue bishops. If it could cause chaos, they used it. And through it all, Fredegund sharpened her daggers, whispered orders in dark corridors, and occasionally poisoned people just to stay in shape. What made this rivalry so uniquely unhinged was its longevity. These weren't one-off crimes of passion. This was institutionalized spite. Two queens, controlling rival kingdoms, systematically dismantling each other's lives, reputations, and heirs. And yet both somehow managed to convince everyone they were the victims. Fredegund would accuse Brunhild of everything from murder to sorcery, while Brunhild accused Fredegund of, well, murder and sorcery. For once, they were both kind of right. If you ever feel your family is dysfunctional, just remember, Fredegund and Brunhild turned an entire generation of Merovingian politics into a revenge saga so complex, even the monks chronicling it had to pause and ask, wait, who's dead this week? So Fredegund became queen. But did she rest? No. Did she rule wisely and foster peace? Also no. Instead, she took one look at her royal court, saw her late husband's surviving children, her stepsons, and thought, you know what would really spice things up? Now history is murky here, because chroniclers weren't exactly writing with 4K clarity. But rumours abound, whispered suggestions that Fredegund didn't just tolerate her stepsons, she favoured them, biblically, and not in the bake them cookies kind of way, more like have them assassinated unless they flirt back sort of way. You know, typical stepmom things. Fredegund's relationship with her stepsons blurred every boundary you'd want to keep unblurred in a royal household. Some accounts suggest she tried to seduce at least one of them. Others imply more. Of course, in Merovingian politics, seduction was often just another weapon in the royal toolkit, somewhere between poison and bribes. This was a woman who viewed incestuous overtones not as a red flag, but as a political strategy. And if things got complicated, that's what daggers were for. One poor stepson, Clovis, was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Another, Merovesh, made the mistake of defying her. He ended up tonsured and locked in a monastery, the medieval equivalent of being ghosted and shipped to Siberia. Fredegund wasn't the warm and nurturing type. She was the type to tuck you in at night and then frame you for treason by morning. Her maternal instincts were, shall we say, weaponized. Now let's be fair. Fredegund didn't invent the chaos. She just embraced it with the enthusiasm of a bored cat discovering a full shelf of breakable things. The Merovingians were already a mess. She just added poison, daggers, and questionable family dinners into the mix. She ruled her court like a spider, always weaving, always waiting, always one scandal away from another mysterious disappearance. And the worst part? She was just getting started. Now, ruling a kingdom in the 6th century was already a logistical nightmare. Roads full of bandits, crops that failed just for fun, and nobles with loyalty as stable as a goat on stilts. But try doing it while juggling a royal family, where every second person is either a cousin or a sworn enemy. And occasionally both. Fredegund, ever the multitasker, found herself in a delicate situation. Her husband, King Chilperic, was dead. Finally, said most of his surviving relatives. That left their young son, Clothar, as heir to the throne. Just one problem. Fredegund had more enemies than allies, and her son was barely old enough to hold a sword, let alone swing it. So naturally, Fredegund did what any protective mother would do. She crushed rebellions, bribed officials, and casually murdered anyone who looked at her child sideways. You know, standard parenting. But raising a boy king in a viper pit wasn't enough drama for our dear queen. She also had to contend with other children, specifically Chilperic's sons from previous marriages. You know, the ones she may or may not have seduced, manipulated, imprisoned or exiled, depending on the weather. Each of these surviving stepsons had a decent claim to the throne, and an even stronger motive to accidentally fall on Fredegund's dagger. And yet, somehow, she outmaneuvered them all, like a medieval chess master whose queen piece was dipped in poison. And then there were the bastards. Oh yes, plenty of them. Some legitimate enough to stir trouble. Others, merely useful rumours. Fredegund knew how to weaponize gossip. If a noblewoman had an illegitimate child, Fredegund might whisper that it was her child. If someone claimed royal blood, Fredegund might suggest they got it by accident, or by night visit. Either way, reputations fell like dominoes, and Fredegund remained upright. And smirking. She wasn't just fighting for a throne. She was fighting to be remembered, or feared, or preferably both. And while her tactics weren't subtle, they were effective. Like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly, then framing the fly for breaking your furniture. Clothar would grow up in this royal blender, sipping milk, while his mother arranged yet another suspicious funeral. And he'd learn one thing early. Never turn your back on Fredegund, especially if you're family. By now, Fredegund had achieved what most royal schemers could only dream of. She was Queen Regent, unofficial Queen of Espionage, and part-time Grim Reaper. But what do you do once you've secured your child's throne and neutralized half the noble population? Simple. You ruin everything else too. Fredegund had no interest in peace. In fact, if a treaty ever came near her desk, she probably set it on fire and blamed the ashes on Brunhild. War wasn't just policy, it was therapy. And with her favourite enemy Brunhild still alive and breathing unpoisoned air, the grudge match had decades of fuel left in the tank. The two queens waged a slow-motion slap fight across medieval France that made the 100 Years' War look like an office misunderstanding. They traded accusations, armies and insults via poisoned messengers and suspiciously lost ambassadors. Fredegund sent assassins the way most people send thank-you notes. She even tried to have Brunhild's grandchildren murdered. Subtlety? Never heard of it. And then there was the church. You might think that even Fredegund wouldn't mess with holy men, but you'd be wrong. She didn't just step on sacred toes, she broke them. She had bishops beaten, bribed, exiled, or accidentally stabbed during communion. If you wore a mitre and got too preachy, odds were you'd end up in a shallow grave or a very quiet monastery. Even Gregory of Tours, a bishop and historian who wrote some of the most scathing reviews of Fredegund's behaviour, had to admit, under duress, that she was energetic in nature, which is monk speak for terrifying sociopath. At court, things were even worse. Fredegund ran the palace like a paranoid game of musical chairs. Nobles were constantly disappearing, staff were too scared to whisper, and the only people getting promoted were the ones with excellent stabbing technique and no surviving family. She ruled through fear, fire, and creative murder. But make no mistake, it worked. Despite everything, the seductions, the vendettas, the graveyard of enemies, she held power, for decades. In an era when queens were expected to smile, bear sons, and politely die young, Fredegund made sure she outlived the polite ones. She wasn't just a scandal, she was an era. If you're wondering whether Fredegund ever mellowed with age, the answer is a resounding absolutely not. She didn't soften, she fermented, and like any vintage bottle of royal venom, she only got more potent over time. Poison, for example, became her go-to diplomatic tool. While others were sending flowers and sealing peace with marriages, Fredegund was stirring arsenic into goblets and calling it hospitality. If you got an invitation to dine with her, you'd be wise to bring your own food taster, and possibly your own stomach. There are tales, possibly exaggerated, but honestly, would you bet against them, that she kept a whole cabinet of poisons, not for decoration, for experimentation? Belladonna, hemlock, wolfsbane. Fredegund was less queen and more gothic apothecary with a revenge kink. And she didn't reserve her talents for nobles or enemies. Servants, courtiers, and the occasional clergy member all found themselves mysteriously ill after incurring her displeasure. One unfortunate woman was reportedly killed simply for gossiping about the Queen's past, which, let's face it, was begging to be gossiped about. Her reputation became so feared that merely being accused of being on her bad side was enough to ruin you. People fled courts, forged alliances with her rivals, or just quietly took up farming in very distant provinces. One bishop allegedly tried to publicly curse her. The next morning, he woke up dead. But Fredegund wasn't all venom and murder. Occasionally, she tried more subtle tactics, like lying, bribing, and forging royal documents. You know, the gentler medieval crimes. She also had spies. Lots of them. If you dropped a critical comment in the bathhouse, it would somehow end up in a royal edict 3 days later, with your name spelled very correctly. It's hard to overstate how thoroughly Fredegund mastered the art of fear. She made Machiavelli look like a motivational speaker. Her enemies were many, her friends few, and mostly terrified. But the most astonishing thing, she was still alive. In a world where murder was a favourite pastime, and royal women were conveniently removed, Fredegund survived everything thrown at her, including the consequences of her own terrible decisions. By this point in Fredegund's story, one might ask, did she ever run out of people to kill? The answer, charmingly, is no. Much like a medieval hydra with impeccable aim, for every rival she eliminated, 2 more popped up, usually with better armour and worse attitudes. Take the church, for example. Fredegund had a complicated relationship with the clergy, meaning she alternated between bribing them and stabbing them, depending on the mood. One poor soul, Pretextatus, Bishop of Rouen, made the fatal mistake of trying to remind the Queen that murder was, technically, frowned upon in Christian doctrine. Big mistake. Fredegund had him arrested, tortured, and exiled. When he returned years later, older, wiser, and slightly singed, she welcomed him back with open arms and a dagger. The bishop collapsed mid-sermon, and rumours quickly swirled that his communion wine had tasted oddly metallic. No one dared say her name, but the fact that the organist fled the city that night was a bit of a giveaway. Fredegund's brand of justice wasn't blind, it just didn't bother with trials. And then there were her diplomatic negotiations. Diplomatic here meaning she sent gifts laced with poison, and followed up with an assassin, just in case. To Fredegund, every gift basket was a potential murder weapon. Imagine trying to thank her for a holiday goose while checking it for hemlock. Merry Christmas, now check your spleen. Foreign ambassadors either left her court in terror or didn't leave at all. Some were never seen again. One envoy, after a particularly tense visit, allegedly converted to monastic life and refused to speak above a whisper for the rest of his days. Even her own allies weren't safe. If you were too powerful, too ambitious, or too attractive in candlelight, Fredegund saw you as a liability. Her rule was one long paranoid opera. Everyone wore masks. Some of them just happened to be death shrouds. In the rare moments she wasn't assassinating bishops or blackmailing nobles, she managed to run Neustria with shocking efficiency. Grain got delivered. Roads were safe-ish. Bandits mysteriously disappeared, presumably after trying to rob someone who turned out to be Fredegund in disguise. At this point, the kingdom didn't ask how she kept things running. They just prayed she wouldn't run them over next. While Fredegund's kill count was impressive, so too was her flair for inappropriate relationships. One particularly persistent rumour, repeated in whispers at court and by more than one suspicious scribe, claimed that she seduced not one, but multiple of her late husband's sons, as in her stepsons. You know, the ones who should have been calling her mother instead of milady. Please stop that. Now, before we take this rumour as gospel, let's remember we're talking about medieval chroniclers, men who believed thunder was divine punishment, and women who read books were witches. So grain of salt, sure. But the number of chroniclers who all independently raise an eyebrow at Fredegund's maternal boundaries makes you think twice. Whether or not she actually bedded her stepsons, it's undeniable that some of them turned up mysteriously dead, banished, or suddenly joined a monastery right after crossing her. And those who stuck around? Well, let's just say there were tension-filled family dinners. One of the more infamous cases involved Clovis, Chilperic's eldest surviving son from his first marriage. He was a natural heir, well-liked, and not coincidentally, dead within months of Fredegund securing her position. Cause of death? Unclear. The medieval version of he slipped on a sword several times. Another stepson, Merovingian, actually tried to rebel, perhaps suspecting that accidental poisoning was next on his calendar. Fredegund dealt with that the way she always did. Manipulation, imprisonment, and maybe a bit of seduction. Again, historians argue. But if your entire royal family starts dying and everyone's writing about your weirdly close relationship with your husband's kids, you don't get the benefit of the doubt. Regardless of whether Fredegund's taste in men skewed dangerously close to family, the rumours stuck. And in medieval politics, sometimes a rumour was more powerful than a fact. She weaponized her own reputation, letting fear do the heavy lifting. She was either the most misunderstood queen in Frankish history, or the most unapologetically scandalous. Spoiler, it wasn't the first one. If there was one person who could match Fredegund blow for blow in cunning, spite, and sheer creative villainy, it was her lifelong nemesis, Brunhilda of Austrasia. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of an unstoppable force meeting a slightly more unhinged, immovable object. Brunhilda was everything Fredegund wasn't: noble-born, educated, and genuinely classy in that reads Latin for fun kind of way. Fredegund, meanwhile, had climbed to the top by sheer audacity, violence, and a firm belief that poison solved most problems. You could say their beef was personal, mainly because Fredegund had murdered Brunhilda's sister. Yes, it's hard to come back from that at family reunions. Brunhilda, widow of King Sigebert, never forgave Fredegund for killing her sister Galsvintha, who had been married to Fredegund's husband before being strangled with the royal bedsheets, an exit that somehow feels too polite for Fredegund. And in true medieval fashion, this grudge blossomed into decades of political sabotage, assassination attempts, and open warfare. If your royal drama doesn't include a murder that leads to two kingdoms waging war for years, is it really worth writing down? Fredegund and Brunhilda didn't just hate each other, they studied each other. Fredegund sabotaged Brunhilda's marriage alliances, orchestrated murders of her allies, and even sent one of her infamous gift baskets across the border. Spoiler, it wasn't filled with fruit. Brunhilda responded in kind, sometimes more diplomatically, sometimes with armies. Their mutual loathing fueled a kind of political arms race, each trying to outwit the other while occasionally pretending they weren't behind every mysterious death west of the Rhine. At one point, Brunhilda married off her granddaughter to one of Fredegund's sons, possibly as a peace move, or possibly to spy on her from inside the palace. It's unclear whether Fredegund saw through the ruse or simply didn't care. Either way, that poor granddaughter spent most of the honeymoon nervously checking her goblet for extra ingredients. In modern terms, Fredegund and Brunhilda would have had one hell of a reality show, probably titled Queens Behaving Badly. Theirs was a rivalry soaked in blood, politics, and the kind of mutual disdain that only two powerful women in a patriarchal world could truly perfect. And trust me, it was far from over. By now, Fredegund's reputation had metastasized into legend. In every smoky tavern and velvet-draped noble hall, whispers about the Queen of Neustria trickled in like bad plumbing, always leaking, never subtle. But unlike most royalty who tried to smother scandal, Fredegund thrived on it. In fact, some say she started her own rumours just to test which nobles were dumb enough to repeat them. If a courtier snickered too loudly about her incidents with stepsons, odds were good they'd find themselves reassigned to frontier administration. Translation: enjoy freezing to death somewhere barbarian adjacent. Court life under Fredegund became a masterclass in paranoid etiquette. Eye contact was a calculated risk. Compliments were potential traps. Even silence could be treasonous. If you didn't laugh at her jokes, she assumed you were plotting a coup. And not laughing at Fredegund's jokes was, in fairness, the most dangerous game. To cope, nobles developed elaborate survival strategies. Some turned deeply religious, hoping piety would keep them off her hit list. Others tried over-the-top flattery. "Your Majesty, your dagger work is simply exquisite today." But most just gossiped behind fans and wine goblets, passing rumours like hot potatoes and praying Fredegund never caught the scent. One noblewoman allegedly tried to warn her cousin about the Queen's morally ambiguous tendencies, only to find her estate burned down 3 days later by what the palace called a lightning strike. That just happened to occur during a drought, with soldiers wearing the Queen's livery. And yet, the whispers persisted, because Fredegund was too compelling to ignore. Her scandals weren't just salacious, they were entertainment. A soap opera for the semi-literate elite. She blurred the line between monster and monarch, and no one could look away. Even the clergy got in on the action, composing vague sermons about unnatural unions and Jezebels among us. Everyone knew who they meant. Fredegund, naturally, responded by increasing church taxes. Subtlety wasn't her strength. Intimidation was. But here's the irony. For all the rumours, Fredegund ruled with brutal efficiency. Crime rates dropped. Enemies of the state vanished, often permanently. And her son, little Clotho II, remained oddly safe. In a world of vipers, she kept her snake pit the cleanest. And that, perhaps, was her final magic trick. Make fear look like leadership. Just when you think Fredegund had peaked, after the poison rings, incest whispers and spectacular body count, she delivered one final horror that even her enemies had to pause and say, "Wait, what?" Yes, dear listener, we now arrive at the baby assassin incident. You see, Fredegund's idea of childcare differed slightly from modern parenting manuals. While today's royal toddlers are paraded around in cute little photo ops, Fredegund's infant son, the future Clotho II, was used as bait. Actual royal bait. And yes, this really happened. Here's the situation. One of Fredegund's political rivals, a noble named Bishop Titus, had somehow survived her earlier attempts to quietly retire him from existence. Fredegund, never one to leave a grudge half-finished, hatched a plan that would make even Machiavelli raise a concerned eyebrow. She waited until a solemn church ceremony, the kind with candles, incense, and a heavy sense of guilt in the air. Then, she placed her infant son, the future king, into the arms of the bishop. Symbolic, right? A touching gesture of trust? Wrong, because in that exact moment, she had an assassin stab the bishop. Yes, she orchestrated an attempted murder during a baptismal ceremony and used her own baby as a human diversion. As distractions go, it's a bold one. The bishop did survive, temporarily, but the message was clear. Fredegund was playing chess while everyone else was trying to remember the rules to checkers. The bishop would eventually meet a much less miraculous end, one that involved less ceremony and more stabbing. Fredegund, as always, avoided any formal consequences, likely because no one in their right mind wanted to be the one to serve her a subpoena. And what about little Clotho? The future king reportedly survived the entire event without a scratch. Honestly, if you can make it through your own christening without being implicated in a homicide, you're off to a strong start in Frankish politics. This incident, bizarre, brutal, and almost operatic in its absurdity, became a perfect metaphor for Fredegund's rule, sacrilege wrapped in silk and power disguised as piety. By the late 580s, Fredegund's list of enemies had grown so long it probably needed its own royal scribe. But one name still lingered at the top of her to-do something about list. Her husband, King Chilperic I. Now, to be clear, Chilperic was no innocent choir boy caught in the Queen's Gothic whirlwind. This was a man so disliked that some chroniclers referred to him as the Nero and Herod of his time. That's the medieval historian's way of saying, not the vibe. He had feuded with his brothers, mistreated his wives, Fredegund included, especially before she became indispensable, and ruled with the warmth of a refrigerator in Lent. Still, they made quite the pair. She with her daggers and poison, he with his paranoia and royal tantrums. A match made in medieval therapy, if such a thing had existed. Then came September 584. Chilperic was stabbed, multiple times, in his hunting lodge. No witnesses, no warning, just the King of Neustria turning into royal Swiss cheese before he could even remove his boots. The suspect list included every noble with a pulse, most of the palace staff, a few disgruntled bishops, and, you guessed it, Fredegund. But here's where it gets juicy. Fredegund was with him that day, and unlike the usual string of dead husbands, servants, or stepsons who accidentally tripped into daggers, she somehow survived the assassination attempt untouched. Convenient? Yes. Coincidental? Please. Some claimed she orchestrated it all, that she'd grown tired of sharing power, or simply preferred ruling alone with a glass of wine and fewer interruptions. Others argued Chilperic had just made too many enemies, and Fredegund merely benefited from excellent timing. Regardless of who wielded the knife, she didn't waste time mourning. Within hours, she'd barricaded herself in the palace treasury with her son Clotha, baby bait, remember him, and the royal gold. In medieval crisis management terms, this was basically a power move worthy of a mic drop. Then she did what Fredegund always did. She took control, declared her infant son king, assumed the regency, ordered a few more executions for good measure, business as usual, and just like that, Fredegund was a widow, and more powerful than ever. All it took was a little blood on the floor and no witnesses. With Chilperic safely 6 feet under, or possibly just in several small bags given the stabbing, Fredegund wasn't just grieving, she was strategizing. And let's be honest, her mourning period was probably shorter than the time it took to refill her wine goblet. Now the sole regent of Neustria, Fredegund had one job: keep her son, Clothar II, alive long enough to inherit the throne. A reasonable task for most mothers. But in Frankish royal politics, that meant surviving assassination attempts, coups, betrayals, and at least 3 bishops muttering curses under their breath. So what did Fredegund do? She turned into a one-woman state apparatus. First, she ramped up surveillance in the court. Spies were everywhere. The man serving your wine? Spy. The woman lighting your candles? Spy. The chicken on your plate? Spy, probably. No one trusted anyone, and somehow, Fredegund knew everything. Second, she purged, and we mean purged, the nobility. If you had once spoken to someone who might have considered siding with Austrasia, the rival kingdom, there was a decent chance you'd soon be exiled, arrested, or end up falling ill after a suspiciously specific pastry. Her poisoner allegedly kept a menu, but it wasn't all murder and mistrust. Fredegund also played a long diplomatic game. She negotiated temporary truces, pretended to be pious when it suited her, and even sent out lavish bribes disguised as gifts. Frankish diplomacy often looked a lot like mafia protection rackets with better tableware. Meanwhile, her stepsons, some of whom had mysteriously died young, were no longer a problem. The surviving few had either fled or decided they preferred farming to ruling, probably after realizing their stepmother had a black belt in psychological warfare and dagger tossing. She even rebranded herself slightly. Less seductress, more protective lioness of the realm. Though she still occasionally executed people for looking at her weird, it now came across as maternal overprotectiveness. Fredegund, to everyone's reluctant amazement, was actually good at ruling. Tyrannical. Absolutely. Bloodthirsty. Without a doubt. But efficient. And in the messy world of Merovingian politics, that counted for something. After all, what's a few executions when you're keeping the realm stable? Fredegund died in 597 CE, probably in bed, which is frankly disappointing, considering the long list of people she ensured didn't have that privilege. There were no fiery uprisings, no final battles, no dramatic downfall from a palace window while clutching a dagger. Instead, she died like a proper royal. Warm sheets, cushioned headrest, and probably one last smug smile on her lips. And what did she leave behind? A traumatized kingdom, a traumatized clergy, a traumatized stepson, the surviving one, and her own son, Clothar II, who would go on to rule for decades, likely due to a combination of inherited cunning and the sheer fear of what his mother might have whispered from beyond the grave. Despite everything, Fredegund's legacy stuck. Historians didn't know whether to classify her as a monarch, a warlord, a serial killer, or just that woman you don't make eye contact with at court feasts. Gregory of Tours, her contemporary chronicler, despised her so much he essentially turned his history of the Franks into a passive-aggressive diary entry every time she was mentioned. But even he couldn't deny that Fredegund won. Her enemies? Dead. Her rivals? Outplayed. Her child? On the throne. Her legacy? A cautionary tale for every noblewoman who thought politics wasn't ladylike. She had no grand philosophy, no book of wisdom, no moral code. What she had was results. And yet, Fredegund never truly got the royal PR glow-up that other medieval queens managed. There are no statues, no glowing epics, no stained glass tributes. The closest thing she has to a memorial is a sort of collective historical shudder. But maybe that's exactly how she wanted it, because while Fredegund didn't die with sainthood or public adoration, she died with control. Control over her son's future, over her enemies' graves, and over a century's worth of scandal and myth that still carries her name today. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the final moments of her life, she looked at her hand, not holding a dagger for once, and thought, well, that went exactly as planned. For the Romans, wine was never just about quenching thirst. It was a mirror of power, wit, and social standing. At the grand banquets of senators and emperors, wine flowed like a river, and the way a man held his cup could speak louder than the words tumbling from his mouth. To refuse wine might mark you as aloof, weak, or worse, un-Roman. To drink too much, however, could turn you into a laughingstock, remembered not for your eloquence but for the way you toppled off your couch into the mosaic floor. The Romans inherited much of their drinking culture from the Greeks, but they added their own flair for competition. Where the Greeks emphasized moderation, the Romans leaned toward display. Who could outlast the others? Who could spin drunkenness into poetry? Who could weave clever insults while still keeping the cup steady? At these gatherings, wine wasn't only for pleasure. It was for proving yourself. At the heart of these contests lay a paradox. Excess was both admired and mocked. A guest who drank boldly might win admiration for stamina, yet the same display could ruin his reputation if he crossed the line into foolishness. Roman writers delighted in telling cautionary tales of senators whose tongues loosened too far, betraying secrets after one cup too many, or of poets whose verses slipped from brilliant to slurred nonsense as the night wore on. But wine itself was also manipulated. Hosts watered it down to control the pace, or served it strong to test their guests' endurance. Drinking wasn't random, it was structured, almost ritualistic. Dice, poetry duels, even improvised games of wit turned the cup into a stage prop. To survive these contests with dignity required more than a strong liver. It demanded social intelligence, sharp humor, and the ability to play the part of the cultured Roman, while the wine clouded your senses. So when Romans gathered at a convivium, a drinking feast, it wasn't simply for merriment. It was a battlefield of words and wit, where the stakes were reputations, alliances, and legacies. And the weapon everyone carried was the same, a cup of wine, raised high under the watchful gaze of friends and rivals alike. If wine was the weapon, dice were the ammunition. The Romans adored gambling, and when alcohol was involved, the stakes became even more unpredictable. At banquets, dice games, often played with small ivory cubes called tali or alea, were the perfect fuel for laughter, rivalry, and humiliation. A good throw could win you the admiration of the table. A bad one, however, might strip you of your dignity as quickly as it emptied your purse. One of the most popular games was the alea, where players cast dice into a bowl and wagered on results. Unlike modern dice, Roman tali had 4 marked sides, each carrying its own value. The most coveted throw was called the Venus, a roll where all 4 dice landed on different numbers. It symbolized luck, beauty, and divine favor, a perfect excuse to raise your cup and demand another round of wine from your fellow players. At the other end was the dreaded dog throw, a miserable result that invited laughter, jeers, and sometimes a penalty sip, or an entire drained cup. But gambling was not just about luck. Strategy and bluffing played their part, especially once the wine began to loosen tongues. Some Romans prided themselves on their ability to read opponents, while others relied on sheer bravado, swearing that Fortuna, the goddess of chance, was on their side. Inevitably, the losers ended up red-faced, not only from the wine, but from the ridicule heaped upon them. The atmosphere during these contests could turn intense. Coins, jewelry, or even favors were staked recklessly as the night deepened. A senator might wager a fortune for the thrill of besting his rival in front of the entire room. For soldiers, dice games became a rougher version of camaraderie, a way to test one another's grit under the haze of alcohol. Yet the dice table was dangerous territory. A man too consumed by gambling risked being labelled weak or dishonourable. Writers like Cicero warned against the addiction of dice, mocking those who squandered reputations over a game. Still, at drinking feasts, fortune's rattle was irresistible. With each throw, guests laughed, cursed, or demanded another pour of wine, turning chance into both entertainment and ruin. For the Romans, drinking was not just about staggering bravado or gambling away a fortune. It was also about sharpening the tongue. At convivium banquets, once the wine began to flow and inhibitions faded, the contests of wit began. Poetry duels were among the most celebrated of these games, transforming the dining couch into a battlefield where words, not swords, were the chosen weapon. The rules were deceptively simple. A guest might recite a line of verse, and the next was expected to respond with one of their own, often improvised, often biting. Sometimes the challenge was to continue a theme: love, war, or the gods. Other times it was an opportunity for ridicule, with clever barbs aimed at rivals across the table. The quicker the tongue, the greater the applause. The slower, or worse, the incoherent, the louder the laughter. Wine loosened the mind, but it also betrayed it, turning the polished rhetoric of sober men into stammering nonsense. These contests could elevate reputations. A sharp, clever verse could win admiration and place a guest at the centre of attention, his cup refilled in celebration of his wit. Roman poets like Catullus and Martial made careers out of such sharp-edged banter, their works filled with the kind of stinging humour that once lit up banquet halls. A successful quip or cutting couplet could make the difference between being remembered as the star of the evening or the butt of its jokes. But the duels were not without risk. Words had weight in Rome, and satire was a dangerous blade to wield. An insult too sharp might cut too deeply, especially if directed at a powerful man. There are tales of drunken banter leading to lifelong grudges, with verses composed at a feast later resurfacing in political vendettas. A misplaced joke about someone's lineage, wealth, or military record could have consequences that stretched far beyond the wine-soaked evening. Still, the Romans thrived on this edge. To them, wit was a mark of cultivation, and the convivium was both stage and audience. In the dim glow of lamplight, as cups clinked and dice rattled in the background, poets and amateurs alike sparred with words, seeking not just victory, but immortality in memory. For in Rome, to drink well was to speak well, and to speak well was to rule the table. Roman drinking games were never just about winning. They were equally about the humiliation of losing. At a convivium, penalties were what kept the wine flowing and the laughter sharp, turning every game into a spectacle of dignity lost and reputations toyed with. The rules were cruelly simple. If you failed, you drank. If you faltered, you performed. And sometimes the punishment was more entertaining than the game itself. One of the most common forfeits was the penalty cup. A loser in dice, poetry, or any other contest might be forced to drain an enormous goblet of wine in a single breath. For seasoned drinkers, this was a badge of honor. For weaker guests, it was a fast road to ridicule as they coughed, spluttered, or passed out spectacularly on the mosaic floor. Laughter always followed, but the memory could cling long after the feast had ended. Others took the form of performance punishments. A guest who lost might be ordered to sing a song, recite embarrassing lines of verse, or dance foolishly for the amusement of the company. In a society where dignity and self-control were prized, being reduced to drunken clownery was the sharpest cut. Roman satire often delighted in these humiliations, painting vivid portraits of nobles forced to caper about while their peers jeered. At times, the punishments grew harsher. Some feasts required losers to kiss whoever the winner chose, regardless of gender or status, an act designed to provoke laughter or discomfort. Others demanded that the loser strip to the waist or crawl beneath the dining couches, barking like a dog or bleating like a goat. The more absurd the penalty, the more delighted the audience. Excess was the point, and the greater the degradation, the louder the cheer. But there was danger too. A man humiliated too deeply might leave with his pride wounded, turning a night of fun into a seed of resentment. Roman authors recorded more than one feud that began over a harmless drinking game, where the insult of a forfeit hardened into political or personal enmity. Still, the thrill was irresistible. To the Romans, the banquet was theatre, and penalties were the comedy that kept the stage alive. Thus, every game was more than a contest of skill. It was a gamble with dignity. In Rome, losing wasn't just defeat. It was entertainment. A Roman banquet was never only about the food or the wine. It was about spectacle. Just as victories in war were crowned with laurel wreaths, victories at the table demanded their own honours. During drinking games, winners were often awarded garlands or crowns made of ivy, roses or myrtle, their fragrant loops perched crookedly on sweat-dampened foreheads. To wear such a crown was a mark of triumph, a playful echo of the triumphal processions that paraded generals through Rome's streets. Yet these crowns were more than decoration. They carried symbolic weight. Ivy was sacred to Bacchus, the god of wine, so a victor garlanded in ivy seemed touched by the god himself, chosen to revel without limit. Roses, by contrast, whispered of secrecy. The famous phrase, sub rosa, under the rose, signified that what happened at the feast was not to be spoken of beyond it. In this way, the crown was not just an ornament, but a declaration. Here, within these walls, excess was sanctioned. The rituals didn't end with crowning. Winners were often toasted in rounds of song, with the rest of the company raising cups in their honour. In some games, the victor was given the privilege of commanding others, choosing the next opponent, assigning penalties, or even demanding that rivals drink until they collapsed. A clever man could use this role to elevate himself, binding allies and humiliating enemies, all under the guise of a game. The loser's role, meanwhile, was a mirror opposite. While the crowned victor basked in applause, the loser was expected to accept his fate with grace, or risk ridicule for lacking Roman gravitas. Some banquets even turned the ritual into farce, crowning the most pitiful drunkard as the king of fools, a parody of triumph that mocked weakness rather than celebrating strength. These rituals mattered because they blurred the lines between jest and power. At the convivium, the crown of roses or ivy might last only until dawn, but the memory of who wore it lingered. A well-timed victory, paired with wit and charm, could enhance a reputation. A poorly handled loss could stain it. Thus, every wreath, every toast, and every ritual carried meaning beyond the moment. Drinking crowns turned wine-soaked games into something larger, a parody of Rome itself, where glory and humiliation always walked hand in hand. No Roman drinking feast was ever silent. Alongside the clinking of cups and the rattle of dice came the pulse of music. Flute players, lyre strummers and singers were hired to accompany the banquets, their melodies weaving through the smoke and chatter. Yet music was rarely background noise. It was part of the game itself. A clever host might challenge his guests to improvise verses to the tune, or force a loser to take up an instrument and perform, often badly, while the room howled with laughter. Mockery was as essential as the wine. Romans delighted in using performance as punishment, and nothing deflated a man's dignity faster than being forced to sing off-key or stumble through a bawdy dance. The line between entertainment and humiliation blurred constantly. A senator who delivered fiery speeches in the forum by day might find himself jeered at night as he attempted to croak out a drinking song in a drunken slur. The very contrast was the point. Wine stripped away the armor of public persona, exposing even Rome's elite as ridiculous mortals. Sometimes the mockery was more direct. Guests exchanged insults, weaving them into rhymes or chants, while musicians punctuated each blow with playful notes. These contests of verbal abuse, called aiosi convivalis, banquet jokes, were considered a test of wit. To be quick with a sharp barb earned applause, to falter invited derision. Roman poets later preserved fragments of this tradition, where insults about gluttony, cowardice, or scandalous love affairs became the sharpest weapons of the feast. But the mockery had a double edge. A jest too pointed could sting long after the laughter had faded. Romans understood the power of words, and while the convivium encouraged freedom, it also risked igniting grudges. More than one rivalry in Roman politics began not in the Senate, but in a drunken hall, with a cutting line delivered over the rim of a cup. Yet the mayhem was irresistible. Music, laughter, and insult turned the convivium into a theatre where masks were stripped away, and everyone, no matter how noble, risked looking foolish. The very chaos was the charm. In these nights of revelry, Rome's hierarchy bent, if only briefly, under the weight of wine, song, and mockery. If dice and poetry tested wit, and mockery tested pride, then endurance contests tested the body itself. At Roman banquets, one of the most brutal games was simply, who could drink the most? Cups were refilled relentlessly, and the guests who prided themselves on strength treated the wine bowl like a battlefield. To falter, to vomit, collapse, or beg for water was to admit defeat in front of an audience that valued toughness almost as much as eloquence. These contests often began innocently, with toasts and songs, but they quickly spiraled into competitions of survival. One goblet led to another, then another, until even the strongest gladiator-like guest staggered. Ancient writers describe participants who drank until they could no longer stand, their attendants forced to drag them away from the couches. Some hosts even measured the volume consumed, crowning champions who emptied the most amphorae. Victory, however, was bitter. More than one Roman fell ill or died from the sheer excess of such nights. Yet endurance was admired. In a culture that revered conquest and stamina, outdrinking others was seen as a mark of virility. To drain a colossal mixing bowl, to stay upright when rivals collapsed, these were feats whispered about long after the lamps were extinguished. Emperors themselves indulged. It was said that Mark Antony, rival of Octavian, boasted of his ability to drink for days without faltering, presenting himself as Bacchus incarnate. Such claims were not merely about pleasure. They were political theatre, reinforcing the idea that only the strongest could rule both in war and at the table. But the dangers were obvious. Excessive drinking could ruin a reputation as swiftly as it built one. The satirists mocked those who mistook gluttony for bravery, describing senators who staggered into the forum still reeking of last night's feast, or generals who weakened their own bodies before campaigns. The balance between admired excess and shameful disgrace was razor-thin. Still, Romans craved the spectacle. Watching rivals collapse one by one while another soldiered on was as thrilling as a gladiatorial match, only fought with wine instead of swords. These endurance contests turned the convivium into an arena, where the last man standing was crowned not only drunk, but victorious. As the night wore on and cups piled high, Romans often shifted from games of chance and endurance to a different kind of sport: storytelling. The convivium became a stage where guests competed not just in drinking, but in weaving tales, jokes, and biting satire. In these moments, wine fueled both brilliance and disaster. Roman satire was born in such settings. Poets like Juvenal and Martial later immortalized the absurdities of drunken feasts: the nobleman who spilled secrets after his fifth cup, the pompous senator who recited epic verse but forgot the ending, the general who boasted of victories while drooling into his beard. These tales were exaggerated, but the seed of truth came from the banquets themselves. To mock drunkenness was as much a tradition as the drinking. Guests often took turns entertaining the company with stories, some recalling myths of the gods, others spinning wild tales of personal exploits. The cleverest twisted these stories into parody. A man might retell the labors of Hercules as if Hercules were a staggering drunk, fumbling his way through monsters and tasks. Another might parody a rival's speech in the Senate, exaggerating every quirk while the others roared with laughter. The line between history, myth, and comedy blurred in the haze of wine, but satire was dangerous sport. A joke about someone's appetite, greed, or infidelity could sting long after the feast was over. Romans delighted in sharp wit, but they never forgot an insult. Banquet rooms became testing grounds for political relationships, where humor could strengthen alliances or ignite enmities. More than one feud began with a cutting story told after too many cups. Still, the laughter was irresistible. Storytelling and satire gave the convivium its energy, turning drunkenness into a spectacle. The loser who stumbled over a line, the rival skewered in verse, the pompous man brought low by parody. All became part of the shared memory of the night, and those memories lasted. Even years later, a man's reputation could be shaped by a single evening, remembered not for his speeches in the forum or his bravery in war, but for the time he sang off-key or was mocked in verse at a convivium. For the Romans, this was the true chaos of wine, not just the physical toll of excess, but the way a single drunken moment could echo into legacy. By the time the lamps burned low and the musicians packed away their lyres, what remained after a Roman drinking feast was more than a room full of empty cups. These gatherings revealed the very contradictions of Roman life. To drink was to live between two extremes, the pursuit of glory and the risk of disgrace. The games reflected this perfectly. Each contest a stage where reputations could rise as quickly as they could fall. For Romans, wine was never simply indulgence. It was theatre, politics, and philosophy mixed together in the bowl. A man's ability to outdrink rivals proved stamina. His skill with dice showed fortune's favour. His sharp tongue in verse displayed intellect. To fail in these contests was to reveal weakness, and weakness in Rome was unforgivable. Yet even in failure there was comedy, and Romans relished the spectacle of watching senators, soldiers, and scholars alike reduced to the same level by Bacchus's power. The convivium, then, was more than a feast. It was a mirror of society. Hierarchies bent beneath the weight of wine. A slave might mock his master through a clever jest. A poet might shame a senator with a cutting line, and a soldier might rise above nobles by sheer endurance at the cup. These moments were fleeting, but they gave a glimpse of a Rome where wit, humour, and chance briefly reigned over rank. Writers often mocked the chaos of these nights, but they also celebrated them. To many Romans, drinking games were proof of their vitality, their refusal to live a life of moderation. In their eyes, excess was not always failure. It was a sign of living fully, of daring to embrace chaos even at the risk of ruin. And so reputations were indeed made or destroyed, not only in the forum or on the battlefield, but at the table, where dice rattled, verses clashed, and laughter drowned out shame. In the end, Roman drinking games endure in memory because they were more than diversions. They were expressions of a culture that glorified strength, mocked weakness, and turned even drunkenness into a performance. For the Romans, every cup was a contest, every feast a gamble, and every moment a chance to prove that life itself was best lived loudly, recklessly, and with wine always in hand. By the age of 32, Alexander of Macedon had achieved what no mortal before him dared to dream. In just over a decade, he carved out the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, stretching from the rugged mountains of Greece to the burning deserts of Egypt, across Persia, and all the way to the mysterious borders of India. Cities bore his name, satraps trembled at his command, and kings once mighty enough to rival him were either dead, disgraced, or absorbed into his new world order. To his men, he was more than a commander. He was a god walking in human form. Yet behind the bronze armor and the legends whispered in every marketplace of Babylon, Alexander was still a man. Flesh, blood, and bone, and more vulnerable than anyone around him realized. When he returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, the conqueror was weary. The campaigns had pushed him to the limits of endurance. Miles of forced marches, endless battles, sleepless nights of planning sieges, and the heavy burden of ruling an empire that spanned cultures, languages, and religions. Even for a man whose ambition burned like fire, there were cracks beginning to show. His body bore the scars of wounds never fully healed. His mind, sharpened by strategy, now wrestled with paranoia, grief, and exhaustion. Still, Babylon welcomed him as a king destined for eternity. Banquets overflowed with wine, musicians filled the night with song, and the great palaces glowed with torches as if the city itself bowed to its new master. Yet in the midst of this celebration of conquest, whispers grew louder. Alexander was not invincible. Some murmured about strange fevers ravaging the marshlands near the Euphrates. Others spoke of plots, assassins, and poisons hidden in golden cups. Alexander himself dismissed the omens. He had always trusted in his star, the divine destiny his mother Olympias claimed was written for him since birth. But destiny, no matter how bright, can flicker. His empire stood at the height of its glory, his armies undefeated, his enemies shattered. And yet, within weeks, this same city of Babylon would witness the fall of the man they called great. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar had never seen such revelry. Alexander, fresh from his Indian campaigns, had returned to Babylon like a victorious god. The great halls blazed with light from countless oil lamps, their smoke curling into the night sky as music and laughter spilled into the courtyards. Golden goblets brimmed with wine, and tables sagged under the weight of roasted meats, honeyed pastries, and fruits imported from the farthest corners of the empire. To his generals and companions, it was more than a feast. It was a proclamation. Alexander's star was still ascending, and Babylon was to be the heart of a new world empire. Yet amid the splendor, there were shadows. The Macedonian elite, hardened veterans of a dozen campaigns, drank deep but whispered still deeper. Many had grown restless with endless wars. Some wanted to return home, to see the hills of Macedon again. Others feared Alexander's growing vision of unity between Greeks and Persians, a vision that unsettled those who still viewed themselves as conquerors, not equals. Alexander himself moved through the feast like a flame, brilliant but unpredictable. His moods shifted with the wine, at times affectionate, draping arms around comrades and boasting of future conquests. Arabia, perhaps even the western seas. At other times he brooded, eyes flashing with suspicion at those who muttered too long in corners. Memories of past conspiracies haunted him. The murder of Parmenion, the execution of Philotas, the brutal death of Clitus the Black, once his closest friend, slain by Alexander's own spear in a drunken rage, that night in Babylon, some said he drank more than ever before. One story tells that he pledged a colossal offering to the gods, draining a cup of unmixed wine in their honor, before collapsing in agony. Others whispered that an enemy's hand had slipped poison into the chalice. Whether by chance, fate, or betrayal, what began as a night of triumph would end as the first step toward tragedy. For within days, Alexander would be struck by a mysterious sickness that no physician, priest, or sacrifice could heal. And in the silence of his chamber, as fever gripped his body, the great conqueror who had stormed through Asia began a battle he could not win. The days after the banquet began with little concern. Alexander had always been reckless with drink and excess. A hangover, his companions thought, nothing more. But as the sun rose over the shimmering walls of Babylon, the king who had once ridden across deserts without water and marched through monsoon rains now lay in his chamber unable to rise. His skin burned with fever, sweat pouring from his body, while a gnawing pain spread through his stomach like fire. Physicians were summoned at once, men trained in both Greek medicine and Persian remedies, but their cures were as varied as they were desperate. Some prescribed cooling baths and herbal tonics. Others called for sacrifices to the gods. Every treatment failed. Each morning, his generals expected him to appear, to shake off his illness and command them as always. Each morning, their expectations crumbled further. Rumors spread quickly through the palace corridors. Poison, some whispered. Surely the cup he had drained at the feast had been tainted. Who had dared such a crime? Antipater, the regent of Macedon, long mistrusted by Alexander. Perhaps one of the generals weary of his endless wars. Or even within his own circle, men like Cassander, who had every reason to resent the king's harsh treatment. The possibility haunted them, for if Alexander could be murdered, then none of them were safe. Others believed the sickness was divine punishment. Had Alexander not claimed descent from Zeus himself? Had he not demanded proskynesis, the bow reserved for gods, from his subjects? Perhaps hubris had finally drawn down the wrath of Olympus. Even the Babylonians muttered that their omens had foreseen calamity. The walls of the city had crumbled during his arrival, a dire sign ignored in the flush of victory. Alexander, weakened but not broken, clung to his vision. From his sickbed he spoke of future campaigns, ordering maps and plans for the conquest of Arabia. His eyes still burned with that unrelenting ambition, even as his body betrayed him. To those who stood beside him, it was unthinkable that death could claim him. He was Alexander, world conqueror, god king, the man who had never lost a battle. And yet, as his fever worsened, a quiet dread settled over Babylon. The sense that for the first time, the great was facing an enemy he could not overcome. As the fever tightened its grip, Alexander was forced to abandon the halls of power for the confines of his bed. The man who once led cavalry charges at the head of his army now struggled to lift his own head from the pillow. Babylon, a city that had welcomed him with trumpets and garlands, fell eerily silent as the news spread. Their king was dying. The palaces that had echoed with laughter during the feast now murmured with hushed prayers and anxious speculation. His generals, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Perdiccas, kept vigil at his side, their faces carved with worry, but their minds racing with thoughts they dared not speak. If Alexander fell, who would rule the empire? No heir had been named. His young son by Roxana was not yet born, and his half-brother Aridaeus was considered unfit to govern. For the first time, the vast empire that stretched across continents seemed fragile, held together by the weakening breath of a single man. Alexander, though racked with pain, retained flashes of his old spirit. He ordered his companions to bring him reports, maps, and dispatches. From his bed, he still tried to command the empire, still planned campaigns into Arabia, as though the illness were a mere inconvenience. His voice was faint, his words often broken by coughs, yet the spark of authority remained. Soldiers outside the palace refused to believe the rumors of his decline. To them, Alexander was immortal. He would rise again, as he always had, stronger than before. But the truth could not be hidden forever. Day after day the fever raged on, and Alexander's once powerful frame wasted away. His eyes, once sharp and filled with fire, dimmed under the weight of illness. Each visit from his generals ended with uneasy glances exchanged in the hallways, each night with whispered discussions of succession. Still, the king clung to life with the same ferocity he had shown in battle. Those who attended him later swore he never once admitted defeat, never once confessed fear. But in the silence of the palace, when his moans echoed through the marble halls, the empire itself seemed to tremble. For everyone knew that if Alexander fell, chaos would follow. As Alexander's condition worsened, Babylon became a city of rumors. Every corridor of the palace, every tent in the military camp, buzzed with the same question. Had the king been poisoned? The suddenness of his illness seemed too cruel, too deliberate for fate alone. Men pointed fingers at rivals both near and far. Some suspected Antipater, the regent left behind in Macedon. Alexander had clashed with him repeatedly, and the king's summons for Antipater to come east had been met with delays. Conveniently, Antipater's son Cassander had only recently arrived in Babylon, and Alexander had humiliated him publicly, slamming his head against a wall for daring to mock Persian customs. Did Cassander carry a vial of poison on his father's behalf, a weapon to end the king's life where armies had failed? Others whispered of Olympias, Alexander's formidable mother. Though fiercely loyal to her son, she despised Antipater and his family. Could she have urged vengeance from afar, setting in motion events that ended in Babylon's banquet halls? Or perhaps the Persians themselves, defeated, subjugated and bitter, had seized their chance for revenge. The stories multiplied, each more elaborate than the last. Some claimed Alexander had downed a cup of wine mixed with hellebore, a deadly herb. Others swore the poison had been so potent that it destroyed the vessel itself, leaving no trace. Yet, despite endless speculation, there was no proof. The physicians found no obvious toxins, only the relentless fever consuming their king. Amid these whispers, fear spread among the generals. If Alexander had been murdered, then the empire itself was vulnerable to hidden daggers and secret plots. Distrust seeped into their councils. Men who had fought side by side for years now eyed one another with suspicion. But Alexander himself dismissed the rumors. He had always trusted in his destiny, believing no mortal hand could strike him down. When asked if he thought he had been poisoned, he is said to have shaken his head faintly and whispered, "No man has the power to take my life, only the gods." And yet the gods remained silent, and his sickness deepened. Poison or no poison, the outcome was the same. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world was slipping closer to death. As Alexander's fever raged on, the air in Babylon grew heavy with dread. Soldiers who had once followed him into the jaws of death now lingered outside the palace walls, waiting for news that never came. Each day, the gates opened only to admit physicians, priests, or trembling messengers. Whispers travelled quickly down the ranks. The king had lost his voice. The king could no longer walk. The king was dying. The generals tried to keep order, but the men were restless. They had marched thousands of miles, fought in unimaginable conditions, and endured every hardship at their king's side. To be denied even the chance to see him one last time felt like betrayal. Rumours of mutiny stirred among the ranks. Some demanded that if their king truly lived, he should show himself. If not, then they had a right to look upon his face before he left the world forever. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was no less tense. Alexander lay motionless, his body wasting away. He could no longer stand, and his words came only in broken whispers. Yet his will remained unbroken. When his generals pleaded with him to address the army, he agreed, not in speech, but in gesture. Carried on a litter, Alexander was borne through the palace gates into the courtyard where his soldiers had gathered. Silence fell as thousands of hardened warriors, men who had stormed cities and toppled empires, gazed upon their leader. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his body a shadow of the man who had once charged into battle with fire in his veins. And yet, as he raised his hand weakly in greeting, a roar erupted from the army. They cheered him with tears in their eyes, not because they believed he would recover, but because he still acknowledged them. In that moment, king and soldiers were united once more, bound not by conquest, but by loyalty in the face of death. The scene left a mark on all who witnessed it. For many, it was the final time they saw Alexander alive. The conqueror who had faced every foe with unshakable confidence now confronted the only adversary that no strategy, no army, and no empire could defeat. The end came slowly, like a torch burning low before finally guttering out. For days, Alexander drifted between feverish dreams and brief flashes of clarity. His generals crowded his bedside, desperate for some sign, some word that would tell them what was to become of the empire they had carved under his command. The weight of the future hung heavy in that chamber, for without Alexander, there was no plan, no heir with the strength to hold the world together. When asked whom he wished to succeed him, silence filled the room. His lips moved faintly, and those nearest bent close to hear. Ancient writers preserved his words differently, but the version most often repeated is chilling in its simplicity. To the strongest. With those 3 words, he cast the empire into uncertainty, handing it not to bloodline or law, but to raw power. Some claimed he meant Perdiccas, his trusted companion who already held his royal signet ring. Others believed he gestured toward his generals as a whole, challenging them to prove themselves worthy. Still others argued that he said Crateros, the name of a loyal general absent from Babylon at the time. But ambiguity was the point. Alexander had lived by strength, his own will, his own ambition, and so, in death, he left the same brutal principle to govern his empire. The chamber fell into chaos. Roxana, his Sogdian wife, was pregnant, but an unborn child could not rule. His half-brother Aridaeus was alive, but plagued by mental disability. The generals looked at one another with a mixture of dread and calculation, each man silently weighing whether he might be the strongest. Outside the palace, the soldiers still refused to believe their king was dying. Some swore he had only fallen into a deep sleep and would soon awaken to lead them once more. Others demanded to see him, to touch his hand, to prove for themselves he still lived. In one final act of will, Alexander allowed it. One by one, the men of his army filed past his bed, many weeping openly as he looked at them in silence. He could no longer speak, but his eyes still carried the spark of recognition. It was the last farewell of a king to the men who had followed him to the ends of the earth. Soon after, his breath faltered, and the torch finally went out. When the final breath left Alexander's body, the silence in the palace was unbearable. For a moment, time itself seemed to halt. Men who had faced death without flinching on countless battlefields now stood paralyzed, unable to accept what their eyes saw. The greatest conqueror in history, dead at 32. No assassin's blade, no enemy's spear, only a fever that consumed him slowly, cruelly, and left the world unprepared for what followed. News spread quickly through Babylon. Soldiers wept openly, tearing their garments, beating their chests in mourning. Others refused to believe it. Some claimed he was only sleeping, struck down by divine trance, and that he would rise again. The air was thick with grief, but beneath it, a darker current stirred, fear. For the empire, vast as it was, had no master. The generals gathered immediately, their faces grim. Perdiccas held Alexander's signet ring, but that did not grant him an empire. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, each had ambitions, each had followers, and none were willing to bow easily to another. Arguments erupted in the council chamber. Some urged recognition of Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, though his mental state made him unfit to rule. Others pushed for Roxana's unborn child to be named heir. But what protection could an infant possibly have against hungry warlords? Meanwhile, the soldiers demanded clarity. They had marched behind Alexander, not for his generals. Without him, would they still fight? Would they return home? Or would they rally behind whichever commander could offer the spoils of conquest? Babylon, once the shining jewel of the empire, now trembled on the edge of civil war. The funeral itself was delayed, as the generals quarrelled even over how his body should be honoured. Some wanted him buried in Aegae, the royal tombs of Macedon. Others argued for Babylon, the seat of his new empire. Still others whispered that Egypt, with its aura of divinity, would be a fitting resting place. This dispute was more than about reverence. It was about power. Whoever controlled Alexander's body controlled his memory, and whoever controlled his memory could claim his legacy. Thus, even before his body was laid to rest, the seeds of conflict had been sown. Alexander's final gift to his empire was not peace or unity, but chaos, a chaos that would soon explode into the wars of the Diadochi. Alexander's death in Babylon did not end his story. It ignited it. Within hours, the empire he had forged with blood and brilliance began to splinter. The generals who had once sworn loyalty to him now eyed each other as rivals, their ambitions unchecked without his commanding presence. What followed became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors, a brutal struggle that would tear apart the world he had built. Perdiccas attempted to hold the empire together, ruling in the name of Roxana's unborn son, Alexander IV, and the feeble Aridaeus. But unity proved impossible. Ptolemy seized Egypt, turning it into a kingdom that would endure for centuries. Seleucus carved out a vast realm in Asia. Antigonus and Lysimachus fought for dominance in Macedon and Greece. The dream of a single empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, died with its creator, and yet, Alexander's shadow never lifted. Cities bearing his name, Alexandria above all, flourished as centres of learning, trade, and culture. Greek language and thought spread across the conquered lands, blending with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions to create a new world, the Hellenistic Age. His campaigns had been brutal, but they left behind a legacy of cultural fusion that shaped history for centuries. The mystery of his death only deepened his legend. Was it poison, fever, or exhaustion that felled him? Historians still argue, each theory adding to the aura of the man who seemed too great to die an ordinary death. His final words, to the strongest, echoed like a curse, condemning his successors to endless conflict. Whether they were truly spoken or later invented, they captured the essence of his life, a world ruled by might, ambition, and daring. To his soldiers, he had been a god in human form. To his enemies, a storm from the west that could not be stopped. To history, he became simply Alexander the Great, a man who conquered the world, but could not conquer time. His body may have been buried in silence, but his name resounded across ages, inspiring emperors, generals, and dreamers. At 32, Alexander left the world not with peace, but with fire, an empire shattered, a legend eternal. In the summer of 80 CE, the city of Rome prepared for a spectacle unlike anything the empire had ever seen. Rising at the heart of the city stood the newest jewel of Flavian power, the Colosseum, a vast amphitheatre of stone and concrete that seemed to scrape the heavens. Where once had sprawled the artificial lake of Nero's decadent golden house, there now stood a monument, not to one man's vanity, but to the Roman people. The Emperor Titus, son of Vespasian, had promised the amphitheatre would belong to the citizens of Rome, and now he intended to prove it with a celebration of unparalleled scale. 100 days of games were proclaimed. 100 days of combat, feasting, theatre, and blood. To Romans, the announcement was more than generous. It was breathtaking. Rarely in the history of the empire had such largesse been offered, and at its centre was the Colosseum itself, an arena capable of seating over 50,000 spectators. Built with tiered seating that reflected Rome's rigid social hierarchy, the amphitheatre allowed every Roman, from senators in marble seats to the poor squeezed in at the top, to witness the same spectacle, united under the gaze of their emperor. The timing was deliberate. Titus had ascended to the throne in the shadow of disaster, a fire that ravaged Rome, a plague that decimated its citizens, and the eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. His reign began under an ill omen, and whispers of discontent spread through the city. These inaugural games were not merely entertainment, they were a political performance, a way to win back loyalty through generosity and awe. By opening the Colosseum with grandeur, Titus sought to transform calamity into triumph. The city buzzed with anticipation. Merchants prepared their stalls, animals were herded into holding pens, gladiators sharpened their blades, and engineers readied the mechanisms that would astonish the crowds. Families spoke of little else, children boasting about the monsters they expected to see, veterans dreaming of naval battles staged on the arena floor. The Colosseum was not yet baptized in blood, but Rome's heart beat faster with the promise of what was to come. For Titus, the amphitheatre was more than stone. It was memory, legacy, and power. For the Roman people, it was a gift paid for in sweat, labour, and conquest, and one that would soon be consecrated with the roar of lions and the cries of men. On the morning of the inaugural games, Rome awoke in a fever of anticipation. Citizens poured into the streets, streaming toward the towering new amphitheatre, whose stone arches gleamed in the rising sun. Vendors shouted their wares, figs, nuts, honeyed wine, while beggars pleaded for scraps, hoping the generosity of the day would extend to them. The Colosseum, with its 4 tiers of seating, swallowed the crowd like a living organism, funneling 50,000 people into place. Inside, the air crackled with energy. Senators reclined on polished marble benches at the arena's edge, their purple-edged togas a reminder of rank. Equities filled the middle tiers, while plebeians and slaves climbed to the highest seats, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Yet despite their differences, all eyes focused on the same stage, the vast oval of sand at the centre, pristine and waiting. The architecture itself seemed to magnify the moment, every voice amplified, every cheer echoing off stone. The Emperor Titus entered in procession, accompanied by lictors bearing fasces and guards glittering in armour. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. For Titus, this was more than pageantry. It was an act of theatre, a carefully staged display of imperial generosity. As he raised his hand in greeting, the cheers rose to a deafening roar, the people's loyalty offered as tribute to their emperor. Then the games began. The opening ceremonies dazzled the senses. Trumpets blared, dancers whirled, priests performed sacrifices to Jupiter and Mars, and the smell of incense mixed with the musk of animals waiting below the arena floor. The Valerium, an enormous awning stretched by sailors of the Roman fleet, shielded spectators from the sun, its coloured panels casting shifting patterns of light across the crowd. To heighten the drama, Titus ordered lavish gifts distributed. Food and coins were flung into the stands, creating a scramble as plebeians fought for morsels of imperial bounty. Some accounts even claimed that Titus himself tossed wooden balls into the audience, each inscribed with prizes, slaves, livestock, or luxury goods, redeemable after the games. The Colosseum was not just an amphitheatre, it was a machine for awe, designed to overwhelm body and spirit alike. And this was only the first day. The promise hung in the air. Gladiators, beasts, hunts, and spectacles beyond imagination would follow. The inaugural games had begun, and Rome was spellbound. Once the ceremonies ended, the true purpose of the Colosseum revealed itself. Trumpets blared, the gates swung open, and the first gladiators marched into the arena. Their armour glittered in the light, bronze helmets polished to a shine, shields freshly painted with bright patterns. They saluted the emperor, raising their weapons high, and the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the stone foundations. Gladiators were not mere fighters, they were living symbols of Rome's power. Some were slaves or prisoners of war, condemned to fight for survival. Others were volunteers, men who sought fortune and fame, wagering their lives for a chance at glory. On this opening day, every type was represented. The heavily armed murmillo with sword and shield, the nimble retiarius armed with net and trident, the fearsome secutor with smooth helmet and short sword, designed to chase his opponent relentlessly. The crowd watched as duels unfolded in the sand. A retiarius cast his net, ensnaring a secutor, only to have it sliced apart in a shower of threads before the killing blow fell. Elsewhere, two murmillos clashed like armoured titans, each blow echoing across the amphitheatre like a hammer on an anvil. Blood soaked into the sand, and with it came the frenzy of the audience. They shouted, gestured, demanded death or mercy with the iconic thumbs turned up or down. Yet the games were not only about death, they were about drama. Gladiators trained in schools to fight with precision and spectacle, prolonging combat so that every slash and feint carried suspense. A wounded man who fought bravely might win reprieve. One who faltered, begging for his life, often met a swift end. The crowd loved courage, despised weakness, and Titus watched, calculating how each display reflected on his reign. To heighten the excitement, pairs fought in succession, wave after wave of duels that filled the day. Between battles, attendants raked the bloodied sand, scattering fresh flowers or spices to mask the smell of death. For Rome, the Colosseum was not a slaughterhouse but a stage, and gladiators were actors whose script was written in blood. By the end of the first round of combats, the Colosseum had been baptized. Its pristine sand was now crimson, its echoing walls heavy with cheers and cries. The message was clear. This amphitheatre belonged to Rome, and its soul would forever be fed with blood. If gladiators supplied the drama of man versus man, the beast hunts, venations, brought a different kind of wonder to the Colosseum. On the second and third days of the inaugural games, the gates opened not for armoured men, but for creatures Rome had dragged from the farthest edges of its empire. Out from the underground cages burst lions from Africa, their roars echoing against the stone walls, panthers slinking low to the ground, elephants draped in foreign trappings, and even crocodiles and ostriches paraded in before the crowd. These animals had been shipped across seas, herded through deserts, and marched along Roman roads solely for this moment, for death on the sands of the new amphitheatre. The venatores, the hunters, were specialists trained to face these beasts. Armed with spears, bows, and nets, they relied on agility and strategy rather than brute strength. The crowd marvelled as a lone hunter sidestepped a charging bull, driving his spear with precision into its flank. Another vaulted over a lunging leopard, striking as it turned. Each kill drew thunderous applause, not only for the courage of the hunter, but for the display of Rome's dominion over nature itself. But the hunts were not always fair contests. Sometimes animals were pitted against each other, bears set upon bulls, lions against tigers, while the crowd cheered the chaos. Other times, condemned criminals were thrown to the beasts as punishment. Their deaths turned into public spectacle. These executions were framed as justice, but to the spectators they were another layer of entertainment, a reminder of what awaited those who defied Roman order. To heighten the spectacle, elaborate scenery was used. Forests of painted trees or wooden backdrops transformed the arena into mock landscapes, recreating the wilds from which the animals had come. At times, entire herds of deer or antelope were released, and archers shot them down in a coordinated display that blended hunting with theatre. For Rome's citizens, these hunts were awe-inspiring. Most had never travelled beyond Italy, never seen a lion or elephant in their lives. Here, within the Colosseum, the empire came to them. Exotic creatures, conquered lands, and foreign wonders were all made to kneel in the dust of Rome's amphitheatre. It was not simply spectacle, it was propaganda, proof that Rome ruled not just men, but the natural world itself. As if gladiators and wild beasts were not enough, Titus unveiled a spectacle that seemed impossible. Naval battles staged within the Colosseum itself. On select days of the 100-day festival, the arena floor was transformed into a miniature sea. Ingenious Roman engineering, hidden channels, sluices and aqueducts, allowed water to flood the amphitheatre, turning sand into shimmering waves. Crowds gasped as they watched ships drift into the basin, their sails trimmed, their painted prows gleaming in the sunlight. These were not mere toy vessels, but scaled-down versions of warships, manned by real crews and armed with oars and weapons. Criminals and prisoners of war often filled the ranks of these sailors, forced to fight for survival in a watery stage from which there was no escape. The Naumachii, or mock sea battles, reenacted famous conflicts from Roman history or mythology. On one day, the crowd might watch Greeks clash with Persians, their ships ramming and splintering with the crash of timber. On another, Phoenicians might square off against Romans, spears and arrows flying over the spray. From their seats, spectators felt as if the empire's conquests were replaying before their eyes, proof that Rome's reach extended from land to sea. The battles were savage, even if staged. Ships rammed into each other with deadly force, men thrown into the water clawing at broken planks as they struggled to stay afloat. Unlike gladiators, who might earn reprieve through bravery, the men in these mock navies rarely survived. The water, meant for entertainment, became a grave for hundreds. Yet for the audience, the danger was part of the allure. To watch the Colosseum hold a sea, to see men die as empires had clashed, was to taste the impossible. The sheer audacity of it all elevated Titus in the eyes of the people. Only Rome could create such a spectacle, and only an emperor with vast resources and will could stage it. For a city that prided itself on engineering and conquest, the Naumachii were both entertainment and demonstration, a reminder that Roman mastery conquered not only men and beasts, but even nature itself. When the water was finally drained and the arena floor restored to sand, the crowd knew they had witnessed a marvel no other city could match. The Colosseum was no longer just a theatre of blood. It was a theatre of worlds. Even as the Colosseum overflowed with violence and spectacle, Titus knew that bread and wine mattered as much as blood. To complement the 100 days of games, he ordered banquets and public feasts that transformed Rome itself into one vast dining hall. For days on end, the empire's wealth was poured into the bellies of its citizens. Streets near the amphitheatre filled with vendors distributing loaves, fruit, and roasted meats, gifts supplied at the emperor's expense. Amphorae of wine were opened freely, their sharp, sweet aroma carrying on the breeze. Citizens drank deeply, cheering their emperor as they toasted to his generosity. In a society where famine was always a lurking shadow, such abundance was as impressive as any gladiator's duel. Inside the Colosseum, food itself became part of the spectacle. Between shows, attendants tossed baskets of dates, figs, and nuts into the stands. Wooden balls inscribed with prizes were hurled into the crowd, redeemable for goods ranging from cured hams to slaves. Children scrambled for them, while grown men wrestled in the aisles, each ball a tangible symbol of imperial bounty. Lavish feasts were staged for the elite as well. Senators and equities dined in shaded porticos, savouring exotic dishes imported from the provinces. Flamingo tongues from Africa, fish sauces from Hispania, spices from the East. For the common people, simplicity reigned, but the message was the same. Rome's emperor fed his city as generously as he entertained it. The banquets were more than indulgence. They were politics. Titus had inherited an empire scarred by disaster, plague, famine, and the eruption of Vesuvius. His reign had begun under suspicion, and these inaugural games were his chance to win the hearts of the people. By feeding the masses, he tied loyalty to his throne with the oldest bond of all, gratitude for survival. The feasts also mirrored Rome's wealth and reach. Every bite, every swallow reminded citizens that their empire stretched across 3 continents, drawing in grain from Egypt, oil from Africa, wine from Gaul, spices from Arabia. The empire's abundance flowed straight into their mouths, and Titus stood at the center of it all as the provider. In the shadow of the Colosseum, the people of Rome dined not just on food, but on empire itself. The spectacles filled their eyes, but the feasts filled their stomachs, ensuring that gratitude for Titus lingered long after the games ended. While gladiators thrilled the crowds with skill and beasts awed them with ferocity, another kind of spectacle unfolded in the Colosseum: executions. These were not quiet punishments carried out in the shadows, but public performances, staged with the same grandeur as any gladiatorial duel. For the Romans, justice itself could be entertainment. Condemned criminals, slaves, rebels, or common lawbreakers were marched into the arena to face their deaths before tens of thousands. Some were thrown unarmed to hungry lions or panthers, their desperate screams swallowed by the roar of beasts. Others were forced to fight each other with poor weapons, their deaths predetermined and their struggles mocked as clumsy imitations of true gladiators. But Titus's inaugural games took executions even further, turning them into living theatre. The Colosseum became a stage for mythological reenactments where criminals played the roles of doomed characters. One man might be cast as Orpheus, torn apart by wild beasts as he played his lyre. Another might be Icarus, hoisted into the air on a contraption of wings before being hurled to his death on the sand. These spectacles blended cruelty with creativity, each death dramatized as both punishment and performance. To the Roman crowd, such shows satisfied on multiple levels. They eliminated criminals, demonstrated imperial justice, and reinforced Rome's power over life and death. But they also fed a darker appetite for spectacle. The thrill of watching men and women perish in ways as elaborate as they were horrifying. Satirists like Juvenal later condemned the bloodlust of the masses, yet the cheers that rang through the Colosseum left no doubt. The audience was enthralled. Executions also carried a political message. By staging them in the amphitheatre, Titus reminded the people that crime had consequences, rebellion would be crushed, and imperial authority was absolute. To witness justice enacted on such a scale was to feel the empire's strength made visible, as unshakable as the Colosseum's stone walls. For those condemned, there was no escape. For the spectators, it was another chapter in the 100-day festival, a grim counterpart to the feasts and games. And for Rome itself, it was proof that even death could be harnessed for grandeur. In the Colosseum, justice and entertainment were one. Beneath the blood and feasting, the inaugural games were never only about entertainment, they were about power. Titus understood this better than anyone. He had ascended to the throne under a cloud of doubt. His father Vespasian had built the Colosseum, but it fell to Titus to open it, and the empire watched carefully to see whether he would prove himself worthy of rule. The 100 days of spectacle were his answer. Each gladiatorial duel, each exotic hunt, each banquet and distribution of gifts was carefully staged to show the people that their emperor was generous, powerful, and divinely favored. The games were propaganda in its purest form, a performance where Titus cast himself as Rome's provider and protector. The scale of his generosity was staggering. Ancient sources record thousands of animals slaughtered, countless gladiators fighting, and entire navies sunk in the flooded arena. The sheer expense must have been astronomical, yet Titus spent freely, knowing that in Rome, spectacle was currency. To win the hearts of the people, he had to dazzle them, and in this he succeeded. The games also reinforced the Flavian dynasty. By tearing down Nero's hated palace and building the Colosseum in its place, Vespasian had reclaimed land for the people. Now Titus made it their theatre, a place where citizens of every class gathered side by side. Senators and slaves alike looked upon the same sand, shouted the same cries, and felt united under the gaze of their emperor. For a city fractured by class, politics, and recent disasters, the Colosseum was both monument and balm. The crowd's response was undeniable. When Titus appeared, the people roared not with suspicion but with adoration. His generosity washed away memories of famine, plague, and Vesuvius. The games transformed his image from untested ruler to beloved benefactor. Roman historians later wrote that never had an emperor been more loved, and much of that love was born in the amphitheatre's shadow. Yet beneath the triumph lay an irony. Titus reigned only 2 years before his sudden death in 81 CE, leaving his brother Domitian to continue the dynasty. But the Colosseum remained, and with it the memory of those 100 days. In stone and sand, Titus had carved his legacy, not as a conqueror, but as the emperor who gave Rome its greatest spectacle. When the final day of the inaugural games drew to a close, Rome was left not only with the memory of blood and spectacle, but with a sense that history itself had shifted. The Colosseum was no longer just a building, it had become the beating heart of the empire. In the 100 days of Titus's festival, the amphitheatre had witnessed every extreme of Roman culture: courage and cruelty, generosity and gluttony, order and chaos. For the people, the games were unforgettable. Families returned to their cramped homes with stories of lions and elephants, of gladiators who fought like heroes from legend, of ships clashing in an arena that had once been dry sand. Children reenacted duels in the streets, pretending to be Mamillos and Retiari. Poets and historians recorded the magnificence, ensuring that even centuries later, the memory of Titus's spectacle would linger in ink and parchment. But the games did more than entertain. They defined Rome's identity. The Colosseum stood as proof that no other civilization could command such wealth, engineering, and manpower. The empire's vast reach was on display in every exotic animal slain, every foreign myth reenacted, every gift thrown into the stands. In one place, for one season, Rome displayed its mastery over man, beast, and nature itself. The amphitheatre also reshaped the rhythms of Roman life. From that summer onward, the Colosseum became the city's stage for triumph and terror alike. Future emperors would try to match or surpass Titus's generosity, hosting games that echoed but never fully eclipsed the first. For the people, attending spectacles here became a civic ritual, part of what it meant to be Roman. The inaugural festival had set the standard. No emperor could ignore the power of the arena to bind, or to lose, the loyalty of the crowd. Titus himself would live only briefly after his triumph, dying in 81 CE. Yet his name remained bound to the Colosseum. Historians remembered him as a ruler, beloved for his generosity, a rare figure whose short reign shone brightly. Much of that reputation was born in the 100 days of spectacle he gave to Rome. In the end, the inaugural games were more than a festival. They were Rome distilled into a single season, brutal, magnificent, excessive, and unforgettable. And in the shadow of the Colosseum, that legacy still lingers, echoing through stone arches that once rang with the roar of 50,000 voices.